Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to be tackling someone who you might not have heard of if you're not a philosophy nerd. But
Well, even if you are.
yeah, fair enough. George Herbert Mead. Um, he's not a household name like, say, William James or John Dewey, but he's a big deal in classical American pragmatism.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, John Dewey himself called Mead a seminal mind of the very first order, so.
Yeah, high praise coming from Dewey. And this deep dive, we really want to make it, for those of you who like to go deep, who are into the philosophical side of things, we're going to try and get into the nitty-gritty of Mead's ideas.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because Mead, he didn't actually publish a big philosophical book, the kind you'd expect from a thinker of his stature.
Yeah, his most famous work, Mind, Self, and Society, it was actually put together after his death from his students' notes and some unpublished manuscripts.
Exactly. So it
Yeah.
wasn't even meant to be like a systematic treatise or anything.
Right. And yet, it became hugely influential, especially in sociology and social psychology. It's basically the foundation of what's called symbolic interactionism, the idea that we understand ourselves and the world through symbols and interactions.
But here's the thing. Mead himself never actually used that term, symbolic interactionism.
Yeah, it's kind of like his ideas took on a life of their own. They spread out and influenced so many different fields. So, what are we going to be looking at in this deep dive?
Well, there's a lot to unpack. We'll be exploring how Mead thought the self develops through communication, his theories of language and mind, the concepts of roles, and the generalized other.
Which are key to understanding how Mead saw the self as a social product, not just something innate.
Right. We'll also be talking about the I and the me, which is a really interesting distinction he makes within the self. And finally, we'll touch on his philosophy of nature, which you can find in his book, The Philosophy of the Present. It's all about emergence and this idea of the present moment being crucial to reality, which is a very different way of looking at things compared to, say, a static view of the universe.
Exactly. So let's start with Mead himself. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? What shaped his thinking?
Well, he was born back in 1863 in South Hadley, Massachusetts. His family was pretty religious. His dad was a congregational minister and later a professor at Oberlin Theological Seminary. And his mom, she was a devout Christian too, eventually became the president of Mount Holyoke College.
Okay, so a pretty strong religious upbringing then.
Yes, but what's interesting is that Mead himself actually moved away from traditional religion later in life. He became more of a naturalist, didn't believe in a personal God or anything like that.
Huh. So that's a pretty significant shift.
It is, and it seems like this tension, between his early religious background and his later embrace of naturalism, it really informed his work. He was always concerned with ethical issues and social reform, even though he rejected traditional religious dogma.
Makes sense. So how did he end up getting into philosophy?
Well, he went to Oberlin College first and then to Harvard. And at Harvard, he studied with some really influential thinkers like Josiah Royce, who was a big proponent of Hegel's philosophy.
Ah, Hegel, the dialectic, the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Exactly. And Royce's interpretation of Hegel had a huge impact on Mead, especially this idea of the self developing through interaction with others. He also met William James at Harvard.
Oh, wow. William James, the father of American pragmatism.
That's right. And there's a fun little anecdote. Mead actually lived in James's summer home for a while, tutoring his son.
Wow, talk about being immersed in the world of pragmatism.
Absolutely. And beyond those direct influences, Mead was also really active in social reform movements. He supported women's suffrage, worked with Jane Addams at Hull House, which was a settlement house in Chicago aimed at helping the poor and immigrants.
So he wasn't just an armchair philosopher. He was out there trying to make a difference.
Exactly. And you can see all these influences, his religious upbringing, his move towards naturalism, his engagement with Hegel and James, and his social activism, all kind of coming together in his work.
It's like he was trying to synthesize all these different strands of thought into something new.
Yeah, and that's what makes him so fascinating, especially for philosophers. He was grappling with some of the biggest questions of his time about the nature of the self, the role of society, the relationship between mind and body, all while trying to find a way to make philosophy relevant to real-world problems.
Okay, so let's dive into some of his key ideas, starting with his theory of language and mind.
Right. Well, for Mead, language wasn't just a way of communicating information. It was the very foundation of thought itself.
So he's saying we can't think without language.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. He starts with this idea of the gesture, which he borrows from the German psychologist Wilhelm Wundt. A gesture is basically any kind of action that another organism responds to.
Okay, so like if a dog growls at another dog, that's a gesture.
Exactly. But for Mead, these kinds of gestures, they're just basic instinctive responses. They're not what he calls significant symbols.
Okay, so what makes a symbol significant?
Well, for Mead, a symbol becomes significant when it evokes the same response in both the person making the gesture and the person receiving it. And crucially, this response has to be anticipated. It has to be conscious.
So it's not just a reflex like pulling your hand away from a hot stove.
Right. It's more like if I say the word tree, you and I both have a shared understanding of what that means. We both anticipate that the other person will have a similar mental image, a similar concept in their mind.
I see. So it's like a shared meaning that we both understand and anticipate.
Exactly. And for Mead, the most important type of significant symbol is the vocal gesture, which is basically just spoken language.
Okay, but why is spoken language so special?
Well, think about it. When you speak, you don't just produce sounds for other people to hear, you hear yourself speaking too. And when you hear yourself say a word, it triggers the same kind of mental response in you as it does in the person you're speaking to.
Ah, so it's like a feedback loop. The speaker is also the listener.
Exactly.
Ye-
And Mead called this reflexivity, the ability to turn back on oneself, to become both subject and object.
Okay, and this is where things start to get really interesting because for Mead, this reflexivity is the key to the development of mind.
That's right. He argued that the ability to use significant symbols, especially vocal gestures, allows us to internalize the responses of others. And this internalization, this ability to have a conversation with oneself using language, is what gives rise to mind.
So he's saying that mind isn't something we're born with, it's something that develops through social interaction and language.
Exactly. And this was a pretty radical idea at the time because most philosophers saw mind as something internal, something private. But for Mead, mind is fundamentally social. It's a product of our interactions with others.
It's like our minds are shaped by the conversations we have, both with others and with ourselves.
Exactly. And this ties into another one of Mead's big ideas, the idea of roles and the generalized other.
Okay, let's talk about that. What did he mean by roles?
Well, Mead observed that a lot of our social interactions involve taking on different roles. Like, think about a child playing pretend. They might be a doctor one minute, a teacher the next, a firefighter the next.
Yeah, and they take on the behaviors and attitudes of those roles, even though they're not actually a doctor or a teacher or a firefighter.
Exactly. And for Mead, this role-playing is crucial to the development of the self. Because when we take on a role, we're essentially seeing ourselves from the perspective of another person. We're imagining how they see us, how they expect us to behave.
So it's like stepping outside of our own heads and seeing ourselves through someone else's eyes?
Exactly. And as we get older, we start to internalize these different perspectives, these different roles, and they become part of who we are.
But it's not just about individual roles, right? There's this idea of the generalized other as well.
Right. So as we interact with more and more people, we start to develop a sense of the expectations and attitudes of the broader community, not just specific individuals. And Mead called this the generalized other.
Okay, so it's like a composite of all the different roles and expectations we encounter in society.
Exactly. And the generalized other becomes really important because it allows us to see ourselves not just from the perspective of specific individuals, but from the perspective of the community as a whole.
So it's like we're internalizing the norms and values of our society.
Exactly. And this internalization of the generalized other is what Mead saw as the basis of self-consciousness.
So for me, the self isn't something we're born with. It's something that develops through social interaction, through language, and through the internalization of the generalized other.
Exactly. And this leads to another really important distinction he makes, the distinction between the I and the me.
Okay, this is one I've always found a bit tricky. Can you explain it?
Sure. So for Mead, the me is the socialized self, the self that's aware of the generalized other and its expectations. It's the part of us that conforms to social norms, that tries to fit in.
Okay, so it's like the me is the well-behaved, rule-following part of ourselves.
Kind of, but it's more than just that. It's also the part of us that reflects on our own actions, that evaluates ourselves based on the standards of the generalized other.
So it's like the me is constantly watching and judging the I.
In a way, yes, but the I is equally important. The I is the spontaneous, impulsive part of the self. It's the part of us that acts without thinking, that reacts to the world in new and unexpected ways.
So the I is like the wild child, the free spirit.
Kind of. It's the source of creativity, of novelty, of individuality. It's the part of us that makes us unique.
Okay, so we've got the me, which is socialized and rule-following, and the I, which is spontaneous and impulsive. How do these two parts of the self interact?
Well, Mead saw it as a constant back and forth. The I acts, and then the me reflects on that action, evaluating it based on the standards of the generalized other. And this reflection can then influence the I's future actions.
So it's like a feedback loop within the self.
Exactly. And for me, this ongoing dialogue between the I and the me is what makes us human. It's what allows us to be both social creatures and individuals, to both conform to norms and to break them.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about how Mead saw language as the foundation of mind, how the self develops through social interaction and role-playing, and how this dynamic interplay between the I and the me shapes our behavior. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about his philosophy of nature, which he laid out in his book, The Philosophy of the Present.
Yeah, this is where Mead gets really interesting, I think. Because he wasn't just interested in the human mind itself, he was interested in the nature of reality itself.
So how did he see reality?
Well, for Mead, reality wasn't static, it wasn't fixed, it was constantly changing, evolving, emerging.
Okay, so he's not a fan of like a deterministic view of the universe where everything is predetermined?
Exactly. He rejected those kinds of views, which were pretty popular in philosophy at the time. He saw the universe as a process, a constant flow of events. And he believed that genuinely new things could emerge in this process, things that couldn't be predicted or explained by what came before.
So he's emphasizing the importance of novelty, of creativity, of the unexpected.
Absolutely. And this idea of emergence is central to his whole philosophy. He saw it happening everywhere, in the natural world, in human society, even in our own individual minds.
Okay, and this is where the title of his book, The Philosophy of the Present, comes in, right?
Exactly. For Mead, the present moment wasn't just a fleeting point in time. It was the locus of reality, the place where things actually happen.
So he's not seeing the past and the future as equally real as the present.
Well, he's not denying the reality of the past and the future, but he's saying that they only exist in relation to the present. The past is what has emerged from the present, and the future is what is emerging from the present.
I see. So the present is like the ground of reality, the foundation on which everything else is built.
Exactly. And this idea of the present being crucial to reality is tied to his notion of sociality.
Okay, now we're getting into some really technical terms. What did he mean by sociality?
Well, Mead used the term sociality to describe the state of being betwixt and between, a kind of transitional phase where something new is emerging, but it hasn't yet fully integrated into the existing order.
So it's like a state of flux, of becoming.
Exactly. And he saw this happening all the time, in nature, in society, and in our own individual lives.
Okay, can you give an example?
Sure. Think about the evolution of a new species. When a new species first appears, it's in a state of sociality. It's different from its ancestors, but it hasn't yet found its niche in the ecosystem. It's still figuring out how to survive and reproduce in its new environment.
So it's like it's testing the waters, trying to find its place in the world.
Exactly. And Mead believed that this process of sociality was crucial to the emergence of novelty because it allowed for experimentation, for new possibilities to be explored.
And this idea of sociality applies to humans as well, right?
Absolutely. Mead saw human individuals as constantly being in a state of sociality as our eyes interact with the world and generate new responses.
So it's like we're always in a state of becoming, always evolving, always figuring out who we are in relation to the world around us.
Exactly. And this is where his idea of the I and the me comes back in. Because for me, the I is the source of this novelty, of this emergence. It's the part of us that's not yet fully socialized, that's not yet bound by the expectations of the generalized other.
So it's like the I is the engine of change, the driver of evolution.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And the me is the part of us that integrates those changes, that tries to make sense of them in relation to the social world.
Okay, so it's a constant back and forth between the I and the me, between novelty and integration, between the individual and society.
Exactly. And for Mead, this is the essence of human existence. We're constantly negotiating this tension between who we are as individuals
Yeah.
and who we are as members of a social group.
Now, one final question before we wrap up. Given Mead's emphasis on the social construction of the self and the power of the generalized other, some people have accused him of being a determinist, of saying that we're basically just puppets of society. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's true that Mead placed a lot of emphasis on the role of society in shaping the self.
Mm.
But he also recognized the importance of individual agency, of the I's ability to act spontaneously and creatively.
So he's not saying that we're completely determined by our social environment?
No, not at all.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying that we're shaped by our social environment, but we also have the power to shape it in turn.
Well, it's like a two-way street.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that Mead was writing in the early 20th century, a time when social forces were really starting to be recognized as powerful influences on human behavior. So it makes sense that he would emphasize the social aspect of the self.
Yeah, and in a way, his ideas are even more relevant today in a world that's increasingly interconnected and globalized.
Absolutely. And I think that's why Mead's work continues to be so influential, especially in fields like sociology and social psychology, because he offers a way of understanding the complex relationship between the individual and society, a way of seeing how we're both shaped by our social environment and how we can shape it in turn.
Well, on that note, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about. Hopefully, they now have a better understanding of who George Herbert Mead was and why his ideas are still so relevant today.
And if they're interested in learning more, I would definitely recommend checking out his book, Mind, Self, and Society. It's a challenging read, but it's well worth the effort.
And for those of you who really want to go deep, there's a whole world of scholarship out there on Mead's philosophy. So don't be afraid to dive in and explore.
And one final thought to leave you with. Think about how Mead's ideas might challenge your own assumptions about the nature of the self, about the relationship between mind and body, about the role of society in shaping who we are. These are big questions, but Mead gives us a powerful framework for thinking about them.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe you'll even come up with some new insights of your own. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
See you then.